Do you remember being afraid of the dark? There's a special kind of fear that only comes out at night. The kind that takes hold when you're a kid at a sleepover, huddled in a sleeping bag, listening to every unfamiliar sound of a strange house, the creak of a floorboard upstairs, the groan of pipes in the wall. You tell yourself it's just the house settling, but what if those sounds started to whisper your name? Tonight, we're going to a sleepover in the dark, with 6 true tales from a night when the midnight whispers weren't just part of a story area, and they were coming from inside the house. The house belonged to Maya's grandmother. It was a sprawling Victorian relic on the edge of a town that had long since started to shrink. It was the perfect place for a sleepover. Isolated, full of shadows, and steeped in a history none of them really understood. There were 4 of them that night. Maya, the host, who saw the house as a familiar playground. Liam, the skeptic, who had a scientific explanation for every bump in the night. Chloe, the believer, who brought her tarot cards and a healthy respect for the unseen. And Ben, who was just there for the pizza and company, a steady presence against the encroaching dark. They laid their sleeping bags in a circle in the grand living room, a cavernous space dominated by a cold, black fireplace. All the furniture was draped in white sheets, making it look like a congregation of ghosts. For the first few hours, everything was perfect. They ate until they were sick, told bad jokes, and Liam mockingly debunked every one of Chloe's attempts to read their futures in the cards. The plan was to tell scary stories to scare themselves for fun. They didn't know the house had its own stories to tell. As the clock on the mantelpiece ticked past midnight, the sugar rush faded, leaving behind the heavy, silent darkness of the old house. And that's when the first story began. Story 1. The first whisper. Ben heard it first. He was lying on his back, staring up into the oppressive darkness of the high ceiling. The others were whispering, a low murmur that was starting to lull him to sleep. He was in that hazy space between awake and dreaming when a different whisper cut through the air. It was sharp, sibilant, and impossibly close. Ben. His eyes snapped open. The sound was so clear, it was as if someone had knelt and spoken right into his ear. He sat bolt upright, his heart pounding. The chatter between his friends hadn't stopped. Maya was giggling at something Chloe had said. Liam was scrolling on his phone, its screen casting a ghostly light on his face. "Did one of you guys just call me?" Ben asked, his voice a little too loud. Liam looked up, annoyed. "No. Why? I thought I heard someone say my name," Ben said, feeling stupid. The whisper had felt so real, but now, seeing their blank stares, he started to doubt himself. Chloe, always sensitive to the atmosphere, put down her cards. "What did it sound like?" "Like a whisper," Ben explained, rubbing the back of his neck, "right next to my ear. It's called an auditory hypnagogic hallucination," Liam stated flatly, not even looking up from his phone. "It's super common when you're falling asleep. Your brain misinterprets ambient noise and creates a sound, usually your name. It's not real." Ben wanted to believe him. It was the logical answer, the one that would let his heart rate return to normal. It was the house was old and drafty. It was nothing. He forced a laugh. "Right. Yeah. Brain stuff. Freaked me out for a second." He lay back down, pulling his sleeping bag up to his chin. He tried to dismiss it, to bury it under Liam's scientific certainty. But he couldn't shake the feeling. The whisper hadn't sounded like a creak or the wind. It sounded personal. It sounded intentional. He listened, straining his ears, but the only sounds were the soft breathing of his friends and the distant hum of the fridge. He told himself it was nothing. Just the house. Just his tired brain. But as he lay there, pretending to sleep, a cold knot of dread tightened in his stomach. He couldn't escape the chilling clarity of that single, whispered word. It was a voice without a body, and it was only the first of many they would hear that night. The house was waking up, and it had just learned one of their names. An uneasy quiet settled over the room. Ben's experience was brushed off as a trick of the mind, but it had planted a seed of discomfort. The fun was gone. Now the darkness seemed a little deeper, the silence a little more profound. They tried to tell the scary stories they'd planned, but their hearts weren't in it. They were starting to realize they might already be in one. Story 2. The shadow in the hallway. Maya saw it next. An hour had passed, and the tension had everyone on edge. To break the silence, Maya suggested a trip to the kitchen for more snacks. Nobody wanted to go alone, so they all went. A small, nervous herd shuffling through the dark house. The hallway to the kitchen was long and narrow, lined with portraits of Maya's ancestors whose painted eyes seemed to follow them. They raided the pantry, grabbing chips and cookies, their nervous energy making them louder than they needed to be. As they started back, Maya paused. She'd forgotten her water bottle. "You guys go ahead," she said. "I'll be right back." She watched their flashlights bounce down the hallway and disappear. She turned to go back to the living room, but something stopped her. A sudden, gut feeling of dread. The living room, their safe base camp just minutes before, now felt like a dark, waiting mouth. Shaking her head at her own foolishness, she stepped into the hall. It was completely dark now, except for the faint moonlight at the far end. She walked quietly on the cold, wooden floor, and that's when she saw it. At the very end of the hall, where it opened into the living room, a shadow detached itself from the doorway. It wasn't a normal shadow from furniture or the moonlight. These were tall, unnaturally thin, and it looked solid, three-dimensional. It was a void in the shape of a man, blacker than the darkness around it. It stood perfectly still. A silent guard at the entrance to the room. Maya froze. Her breath caught in her throat. Her mind raced. Was it Liam, playing a prank? But this shape was too tall, too slender to be any of her friends. As she watched, paralyzed, the shadow moved. It didn't walk. It glided, a smooth, unnatural slide from one side of the doorway to the other, and melted back into the darkness. Just like that, it was gone. A choked gasp escaped her. She stumbled back into the kitchen doorframe, her heart hammering like a trapped bird. She didn't scream. The fear was too deep for that. She fled back into the kitchen, where her friends looked up, confused by her wide-eyed terror. "There's something in the hallway," she breathed, her voice trembling. "I saw it. A shadow. A man?" Liam, of course, was the first to argue. "Maya, it's a trick of the light. This house is full of weird shadows." He tried to sound reassuring, but his voice was tight. He got up and strode to the hallway, shining his phone's flashlight into the darkness. "See? Nothing. Just a creepy old hallway." But Maya knew what she'd seen. It wasn't a trick of the light. It was a presence. Something was watching them. The whisper Ben had heard now had a shape. The fear was no longer a vague feeling. It was a certainty. They were not alone. Liam's confident act did little to calm anyone down. Maya's terror was real, and it was contagious. The snacks were forgotten on the kitchen counter. They huddled back in their sleeping bags, no longer in a circle, but in a tight clump in the center of the room. The thought of anyone being alone, even for a second, was now unthinkable. The night wasn't about fun anymore. It was about survival. Story 3. The knocking from within the hours after Maya saw the Shadow Man were the worst. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind felt like a threat. They were all wide awake, a small island of terrified kids in an ocean of darkness. They spoke in whispers, afraid of attracting attention. Chloe had her eyes squeezed shut, muttering what sounded like a prayer. Ben kept glancing toward the hallway. Even Liam had finally put his phone away, his skepticism crumbling under the palpable fear. That's when the knocking started. It wasn't loud. It was soft, rhythmic, and it came from a place that made no sense. Tap, tap, tap. It came from the wall next to the fireplace, from inside a shallow closet used for storing old newspapers. "What was that?" Chloe whispered. "It's just the pipes," Liam said immediately, though his voice lacked conviction. "Old houses make noises. Tap, tap, tap." It was clearer this time. Not the groan of pipes. It was the distinct sound of knuckles on wood, but it was coming from inside a closet on an exterior wall. There was nothing on the other side but the cold night air. Ben got to his feet, his flashlight beam trembling as he aimed it at the closet door. "There's no one in there," he said, mostly to convince himself. Tap, 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 tap. The sound was insistent now. Patient, it felt like it was waiting for an answer. Maybe it's a branch hitting the wall outside. Maya offered, her voice a thin thread of hope. There aren't any trees on that side of the house, Liam muttered, his face pale. The logical explanations were running out. The knocking stopped. The sudden silence was almost as jarring as the sound. They all held their breath. For a full minute, nothing. Liam let out a shaky sigh. It was probably just a loud, splintering crack echoed from inside the closet, followed by a frantic, desperate scratching. It sounded like a trapped animal, or worse, something trying to claw its way out. The sound was violent, scraping and tearing at the inside of the door. This was no longer a subtle whisper or a fleeting shadow. This was a physical, violent force trapped just feet away. Chloe let out a terrified whimper. Ben backed away from the door. "We need to get out of here," Maya said, her voice shaking. "Now." But as she spoke, the scratching stopped, and from inside the closet, a new sound emerged. A low, guttural chuckle. A dry, rattling sound that mocked their terror. It was the sound of pure malice, and it confirmed their deepest fear. Whatever was in the house with them wasn't just a ghost. It was intelligent, and it was enjoying their fear. Panic took over, but the idea of leaving, of crossing the dark room, navigating that hallway, and fumbling with the locks while that thing was loose, was a new kind of terror. They were paralyzed, caught between the need to flee and the fear of what they'd meet if they tried. They were trapped. Story 4. The mimic. They retreated to the farthest corner of the room, pressing themselves against the wall. The laughter had faded, but it echoed in their minds. The house was now an active predator, and they were its cornered prey. No one spoke. What was there to say? Liam's science, Chloe's spirituality, all of it had been stripped away, leaving only raw, animal fear. They must have sat like that for nearly an hour. Then, a voice broke the silence. "Guys, I think it's gone." It was Chloe's voice, but it hadn't come from the huddle where they were all sitting. It came from the hallway. They all spun around, flashlights converging on the dark archway. No one was there. Chloe was right beside them, her eyes wide with horror. She shook her head frantically, a hand clamped over her mouth. "It's trying to trick us," Liam whispered, his voice hoarse. "Don't move." A few silent moments passed. Then, the voice came again, closer this time. It was Chloe's voice, but flat and empty. A perfect copy, but utterly lifeless. "Maya, I'm scared. Can you come here? I think I saw something." Maya flinched. Hearing her name in that dead replicated voice felt like a violation. It was learning. It had heard Ben's name, seen Maya, and listened to them talk. Now it was using their own voices against them, trying to lure one of them away from the group. "Don't listen," Maya Ben said, grabbing her arm. "It's not her." The voice tried again, this time desperate and pleading. "Please, Liam, you're the brave one. Can you come check?" I heard a noise in the kitchen. It was masterful, using their own personalities against them, appealing to Maya's responsibility as the host and Liam's need to be the brave skeptic. The thing in the dark wasn't just a monster. It was a strategist. Then it changed tactics. A new voice drifted from the hall, a perfect imitation of Liam. "It's okay, everyone." I checked. It was just a shutter banging outside. "We're all just freaking ourselves out." Liam stared at the hallway, his face a mask of disbelief. Hearing his own rationale tone used to spin a lie was the final blow. He just shook his head, speechless. The mimicry was the most terrifying thing yet. A whisper is scary, but this was a direct assault. The entity was inside their heads, turning their trust into a weapon. They looked at each other with a new, terrible suspicion. If it could perfectly imitate their voices, how could they trust what anyone said? The whispers from the dark had now crept inside their circle, isolating each of them in their own bubble of fear. Transition for the trust between them was shattered. They huddled together, but there was a new distance in their eyes. Every word was now suspect. The house had turned them against each other without laying a hand on them. The fear was no longer just about the thing in the dark. It was about the friend sitting right next to you. Story 5. The reflection's silence returned, but it was heavy and paranoid. No one dared to speak, terrified the entity would steal their voice next. The moon had shifted, leaving the room almost completely dark. Chloe was crying silently, tears tracking paths through the grime on her face. Her whimpering finally made Liam move. He couldn't just wait anymore. He had to do something. "I'm going to look out the window," he whispered, his own voice sounding foreign. "To see if it's sunrise yet." "Don't," Maya pleaded, grabbing his sleeve. "Don't go near the windows." "I'm not leaving the room," he insisted, pulling away. "I just need to see the sky." He walked slowly toward the large bay window that overlooked the overgrown garden. At night, the old, warped glass was a black mirror. He cupped his hands around his face to block the flashlight reflections and peered out. He could just make out a faint, gray line on the horizon. Not dawn yet, but close, a tiny flicker of hope. He relaxed and dropped his hands. For a split second, he saw his own reflectional, pale, frightened face staring back. And then, it changed. In a heartbeat, his reflection blinked. But he didn't. His reflection smiled a wide, predatory grin that stretched his mouth unnaturally, showing too many teeth. The eyes in the reflection weren't his. They were black, empty pits of hate that stared not at him, but through him. At his friends huddled in the corner. Liam let out a strangled cry and staggered backward, tripping and crashing to the floor. His flashlight clattered away. "Liam, what is it?" Ben yelled, scrambling toward him. Liam couldn't speak. He just pointed a trembling finger at the window. His face. Maya and Ben shone their lights on the glass, but saw only their own startled reflections. "There was nothing there, man," Ben said, helping Liam up. "You're shaking." "My face," Liam stammered, his voice cracking. "In the window. It wasn't my face. It was smiling at me. The eyes. ... double quotes." He couldn't finish, burying his face in his hands. This was a new level of violation. The entity had moved beyond sounds and shadows. It had shown itself, wearing one of their own faces as a mask. It was a direct confrontation designed to shatter a person's sense of self. Liam, the skeptic, who clung so desperately to logic, had come face to face with the impossible. And it broke him. The thing in the house was no longer just a presence. It had a face. And it was a face they all knew. There was no more rationalizing, no more hope that this was all a misunderstanding. They had been taunted, hunted, and psychologically broken. The sun was still hours away, and the thing in the house was escalating its attack. They were no longer just trying to survive the night. They were trying to survive the next minute. Story 6. The confrontation, the end, began not with a whisper, but with a sudden, deafening silence. The creaks of the house, the wind, the hum of the frigate, all just stopped. The world outside their small circle of light seemed to vanish. The silence pressed in, heavy and expectant. And then, the whisper came again. But, this time, it was all around them. A chorus of overlapping whispers filled the room, coming from every corner, the ceiling, the floor. They were unintelligible, like dry, rustling leaves. but the malice was unmistakable. They screamed. A single, unified sound of pure terror. It was exactly what the entity wanted. The moment they screamed, the house exploded into chaos. The closet door flew open with enough force to crack the plaster wall. A blast of frigid, foul air rushed out, extinguishing their phone flashlights one by one, plunging them into absolute, total darkness. Pure panic. They scrambled away, tripping over sleeping bags and each other. A lamp crashed to the floor. Curtains were torn from their rods. The sound of shattering glass erupted as something was thrown against the bay window. A voice roared through the chaos, no longer a whisper, but a deep, guttural sound that shook the very foundations of the house. It was a dozen voices speaking at once, but one word cut through the noise, clear and commanding. "Get out." It wasn't a warning. It was a declaration of ownership. That's all they needed. Fueled by adrenaline, they scrambled for the hallway. Maya found Chloe's hand in the dark. Ben grabbed Liam, who was still muttering, and dragged him along. They stumbled down the hall, a gauntlet of unseen terrors. Portraits fell from the walls. Unseen hands seemed to brush their faces and pull at their clothes. They reached the front door, fumbling blindly with the locks. Ben's shaking hands finally managed to turn the deadbolt. As they threw the heavy door open, a final, deafening shriek of rage erupted from the living room, a sound of thwarted hunger and pure hatred. They didn't stop running. They poured out into the pre-dawn twilight and ran across the overgrown lawn without looking back. They didn't stop until they hit the main road, lungs burning, minds shattered. They just stood there, for teenagers in pajamas, gasping for air on the side of a deserted road as the first faint rays of sun pierced the horizon. They watched the dark, silent house that had almost consumed them. The night was over, but they knew the whispers would follow them forever. They never really spoke of what happened in that house. How could they? There were no words for the way the terror had built, how the entity had systematically dismantled their courage, their logic, and their trust in each other. The house was sold a year later, but no one ever stayed for long. Locals still talk about the sounds that come from it on moonless nights faint. Whispers that seem to call your name from the dark windows. For Maya, Liam, Chloe, and Ben, the experience left a permanent scar. They learned the hard way that some scary stories aren't just stories. They learned that when you're at a sleepover in the dark, you should never, ever listen to the midnight whispers, because sometimes they're real. And they want you to answer. If you have your own chilling encounter from a sleepover, a story that still keeps you up at night, I want to hear it. Share your tale in the comments below, or send it to the email in the description. Your story could be featured in a future video. And if you enjoyed these dailies from the dark, be sure to like this video, subscribe, and hit that notification bell. You never know what might be whispering in the next shadow.